Have you ever had days when the weight of life felt almost unbearable? Days when waking up seemed like a challenge, when every breath carried an invisible burden. The pain of uncertainty, the fear of tomorrow, the feeling that, perhaps, God is distant. As if your prayers hit the ceiling and returned unanswered. You look around, and everything seems still. The problems are still there. Time passes, but the solution doesn't come, and then doubt starts to whisper, "Has God forgotten me?" I know you've thought about this. I know that at some point the pain made you question. But listen, God has never left you. Even when you felt alone, He was there. When tears fell silently on your pillow, He wiped each one. When no one noticed your pain, He did. Because He is a God who sees. Hagar, a forgotten woman, rejected, fleeing into the desert with her son, thought she was alone. But God found her there, in the middle of nowhere, and called her by name. I am the God who sees. And that same God who saw Hagar in the desert sees you now. He knows what you've been facing. He knows the weight you carry. He knows the wounds that no one else can see. But there's something you need to remember. The battles you face are not just external. They are, above all, internal. The greatest war takes place within your mind. Doubt against faith. Fear against trust. Hopelessness against promise. And the enemy knows this. He knows that if he can paralyze your mind, he can paralyze your life. He wants you to believe there's no way out, that your story ends here. But God has something different in store for you, because every time doubt screams, God whispers hope. Every time fear grows, God reminds you that He is still in control. Every time you think about giving up, He tells you, I am with you. But you need to choose which voice you will believe. Fear says there's no way out. God says, I am the way. Pain says it will never go away. God says, I am the healing. Loneliness says no one cares. God says, I loved you first. Now take a moment and look within yourself. What has been dominating your mind? Are they thoughts from God or the lies of the enemy? Because the truth is this, you are not what your circumstances say you are. You are not defined by your failures. You are not your pain. You are not your defeat. You are what God says you are. And He says you are loved. He says you are chosen. He says you are strong. But to live out this truth, you need to renew your mind. Paul wrote, Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do you know what that means? It means that even when everything around you says there is no hope, your mind must be anchored in the truth of God. It means that even when the circumstances scream it's the end, your faith must declare a new beginning. But I know it's not easy. I know there are days when exhaustion wins, days when the will to fight disappears. But listen, God did not call you to walk by sight. He called you to walk by faith. And faith does not need to see to believe. Faith simply trusts. When Abraham climbed Mount Moriah, he didn't know how God would provide. But he climbed anyway. When Peter stepped out of the boat, he didn't know how his feet would hold on the water, but he stepped out anyway. And now God is calling you to trust. You may be standing before a closed sea. You may be in front of a valley of dry bones. You may be looking at something that seems irreversible. But God wants to remind you that He specializes in the impossible. The sea in front of you, He can part it. The dry valley, He can fill it with life. What seemed dead, He can resurrect it. But you need to take the first step. Faith does not wait for circumstances to change to start believing. Faith believes, and then circumstances change. Now, I want you to do something. Look at your life. See the places where doubt has tried to reign. Notice the moments when fear has spoken the loudest. And decide now that this will no longer control you. Decide now that your mind will be renewed, that your faith will be strengthened, that your hope will be restored. Because God has not finished the work in your life. The story is not over yet. And in the right time, you will see. You will see the impossible happen. You will see doors open. You will see the miracle take shape. But until then, persevere, keep walking, keep believing, because he who promised is faithful. And he never fails. Write in the comments, "I choose faith," if you believe that God will do the impossible for you. I know that sometimes everything seems too silent. You pray, wait, cry out, but nothing changes. And this silence from God can feel like the most terrifying void. You feel as if you are alone in a dark room, searching for an exit that doesn't appear. But you know what's interesting? God's silence never means absence. It never means abandonment. Jesus was in a boat with his disciples when a storm arose. The wind was howling, and the waves rose like walls ready to swallow everything. And where was Jesus? Sleeping. And the disciples, desperate, woke him up saying, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" That is the question despair asks. When the waters rise, when answers don't come, when pain lingers for days, weeks, years. Lord, do you not care? But Jesus got up. He looked at the raging sea, and with just one word, everything calmed down. Because he never lost control. His silence never meant inaction. It never meant indifference. He was there all along, waiting for the right moment to act. And this is what you need to understand. God's silence is an invitation to trust. When you don't hear his voice, it's the time to remember what he has already said. Because God never needed to repeat a promise for it to still apply. If he said he will do it, he will do it. But it will be in his time. And this waiting period is not punishment, nor is it rejection, it's preparation. Because God doesn't just want to change your situation. He wants to change you. He wants your faith to grow. He wants your mind to be renewed. He wants your heart to align with his, because the promise cannot find you unprepared. What good is it for God to take you to the promised land if your mindset is still that of a slave? What good is it for God to open a door if your heart is still full of fear? There are battles that need to be won within you before the blessings come to you. That's why God places you in the desert. The desert is not punishment, it's transformation. It was in the desert that God fed the people with manna. It was in the desert that he caused water to spring forth from the rock. It was in the desert that he taught that his presence is enough. And now, look at your life. You may be in the desert. Perhaps everything around you is dry. Maybe the heat of the trial is burning your hope. But listen, God is here. The same God who sustained Israel in the desert is the God who is sustaining you now. And he didn't bring you this far to abandon you. He didn't make you start just to leave you halfway. He didn't allow you to go through all of this to see you fail. So rise up, lift your head, because the desert has an end. And after the desert comes the promised land. But to get there, you need to keep moving forward. You need to trust. You need to believe that God is already in your tomorrow, preparing the way, relieving the burden, strengthening your faith. He has already seen the end of your story, and it is a victorious ending. Now pause and think. How many times has God delivered you? How many times has he done the impossible for you? If he has done it before, why wouldn't he do it again? The enemy wants you to forget. He wants you to focus on the problem, the lack, the fear. But today, God is saying, remember. Remember who I am. Remember what I have done. Remember that I am faithful. Because God's faithfulness does not depend on your strength. It does not depend on your worthiness. It does not depend on your past. God is faithful because that is his nature, and if he has promised something about your life, nothing can stop that from happening. Now, look inside yourself. What is weighing on your heart? What has been keeping you awake at night? What is causing your faith to waver? Maybe it's fear, maybe it's doubt, maybe it's the feeling that you have tried everything and nothing has changed. But I want to remind you of something. God's timing is not your timing. God's timing isn't rushed. God's timing is perfect. When Martha and Mary sent a message to Jesus saying that Lazarus was sick, he took his time, and when he finally arrived, Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. It seemed that Jesus had come too late, but he is never late. he arrives just in time. Because sometimes God allows something to die so that his glory can be manifested even greater. He allows things to spiral out of your control so that you learn to trust him completely. And that's what happened with Lazarus. Jesus went to the tomb and said, "Roll away the stone." And I ask you, what is the stone that needs to be removed in your life? The stone of unbelief? The stone of fear? The stone of resentment? Because before the miracle happens, something needs to be removed. And after the stone was rolled away, Jesus called Lazarus by name, and death lost its power. Because when Jesus calls, nothing can resist. Now I want you to think about this. What feels dead in your life? Which promise seems buried? What dream have you given up on? Jesus is calling now. He's calling life back. He's saying, "I am the resurrection and the life." What was dead can live again. What seemed lost can be restored. What appeared impossible can become reality. But you need to believe. You need to roll away the stone. You have to trust that God never lost control. Even when everything seems hopeless, he already has a plan. Even when you thought it was the end, he had already written a new beginning. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and surrender everything to him. Surrender your fears, surrender your doubts, surrender your plans, because God is in control. And in due time, you will see the resurrection happen. You will see his glory manifest in your life. So lift your head, walk in faith, because he who promised is faithful to fulfill, and nothing can prevent what he has already determined for you. Write in the comments, "I am light." If you desire for your life to reflect the glory and love of God, you need to understand that your life is not an accident. Nothing is happening by chance. God did not create you without a purpose. He does not waste lives, does not throw destinies away, does not ignore those he formed with his own hands. But I know that sometimes everything around you screams the opposite. The circumstances seem random, problems arise without warning, days pass without you seeing a significant change. You pray and wait, but it feels like the answer never comes. And in that moment, doubt creeps in like a subtle voice. Does God really have a plan for me? I need you to stop right now and listen. God has a plan, a perfect plan. And even if you don't understand it now, even if it seems like everything is falling apart, he is still in control. The Bible says that God's thoughts are higher than ours. This means that there are things happening behind the scenes of your life that you can't even imagine. There are battles being won in the spiritual realm before you even realize it. The question isn't whether God has a plan. The question is, do you trust enough to follow that plan, even without understanding it? Abraham had to leave his land without knowing where he was going. Moses had to face Pharaoh without knowing how the people would be freed. Joseph had to endure years in prison before seeing his dream come to pass. And you? Are you willing to keep going even without all the answers? Because faith doesn't require a detailed map. Faith requires steps, steps of obedience, steps of trust, steps that challenge logic. And that's what God is asking of you today. To keep going, to not give up, to believe that in the right time, everything will make sense. But I know there's a voice inside you saying, "I've already tried, I've already waited, and nothing has changed." Do you know who else thought that way? Peter. He spent the entire night trying to fish. He cast the net multiple times. He did everything he knew how to do, but nothing. No fish. And then at dawn, Jesus shows up and says, "Cast the net on the other side." Peter could have refused. He could have said, "I've tried everything. It doesn't make sense to try again." But instead he said, "At your word, I will cast the net." And at the moment he obeyed, at the moment he trusted, his net was filled with fish like never before. Do you understand what that means? The miracle didn't happen because Peter was a better fisherman at that moment. The miracle happened because he trusted in the word of Jesus. And that's the secret. It's not about how much you've already tried. It's not about how hard you've worked. It's about where you're placing your trust. If God says to try again, then try. If He says to wait a little longer, then wait. Because in due time what seems empty today will be filled with abundance. But I know waiting is hard. I know there are moments when the pain of waiting is almost unbearable. But you're not waiting alone. You're waiting with God. And when you wait on God, it's never wasted time. Now take a look at your life. What are you holding on to, afraid to let go? What has God already asked you to surrender, but you insist on keeping? Because there are moments when God asks us to give something up, not because He wants to take it away from us, but because He wants to give us something greater. It was like that with Abraham. It was like that with Peter. It was like that for so many men and women in the Bible. And now, it's like that for you. God is calling you to a new level of faith, to trust beyond what your eyes can see, to walk even when the ground feels unsteady. And if you take that step, if you throw yourself completely into God's arms, something will change. Not because circumstances will transform overnight, but because you will be transformed. And when God transforms you on the inside, what's outside begins to align with His will. So decide today, decide to trust, decide to follow, decide not to let fear have the final word, because your story isn't over yet. The best of God is still to come. But to get there, you need to keep moving forward, and I know there are moments when everything within you wants to stop. I know there are days when the desire to give up is strong, but listen, one day David was fleeing from Saul. He hid in a cave, tired and worn out, feeling alone. He was God's anointed, but at that moment, all he could see was persecution and uncertainty. But you know what happened? The one who entered the cave as a fugitive came out as a king, because God never allows a cave without a purpose for it. And if today you feel like you're in a cave, know that this is not the end. God is still writing your story. The storm may be fierce, but it won't last forever. Weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And if you stand firm, if you keep believing, you will see what God has already prepared for you. You will see doors opening. You will see answers coming. You will see that all this time of waiting was worth it. So, don't stop now. Don't back down. Don't give up, because your victory is already on its way. Just trust, because He who promised is faithful. Write in the comments, I believe in healing. If you trust that God can restore your health and your heart. I know there are times when your faith feels fragile, as if it's just a tiny flame flickering in the wind. You try to believe, you try to trust, but the waves come and threaten to extinguish that last spark of hope. But listen, even a small faith is still faith. Jesus said that if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, we can move mountains. The problem isn't the size of your faith, but where it is anchored. If your faith is anchored in circumstances, it wavers. If your faith is anchored in people, it will disappoint you. If your faith is anchored in God, it remains steady, because God doesn't fail. He doesn't change. He isn't late. What He promised, He will fulfill. But I know there are days when it seems like God's promises are too far away, as if He has forgotten what He told you, as if His word is no longer for you. But let me remind you of something. Joseph had a dream. God showed him that one day he would rule, that one day he would be in a place of honor. But before that, Joseph was sold by his own brothers. He was thrown into a pit. He was unjustly imprisoned. He was forgotten. Years passed, and each day seemed to take him further from the promise. But then, in an instant, God took him out of prison and placed him in the palace. Do you know what that means? It means that no matter where you are right now, God has a way to take you where He promised. No matter how difficult your situation is, God can turn everything around in an instant. And when he acts, there's no closed door, no chain that remains, and no barrier that holds. But you need to keep believing. You need to keep moving forward. Because there's a time between the promise and its fulfillment, and it's during this time that God shapes you. It's during this time that he strengthens your faith. It's during this time that he works within you so that when the promise arrives, you are ready to receive it. Because God not only wants to take you to the promise, he wants you to be equipped to stay in it. And that requires preparation. It requires faithfulness even when things don't make sense. It requires trust even when everything seems against you. Now look at your life. What has God already spoken to your heart? What promises has he given you? If he said he would do it, then he will. But until then, trust. Because he doesn't lie. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't forget what he promised. And at the right moment, at the exact time, he will act. But you can't stop now. You can't let discouragement make you give up, because your victory might be closer than you think. Perhaps you are on the 7th day around the walls of Jericho. Maybe you just need one more lap. What if you give up now? What if you stop now? What if you let fatigue rob you of what is so close to happening? No, you need to keep going. You need to trust. You need to believe that God is at work, even when you don't see it. Because he always is. When Peter was in prison, the church prayed for him. The chains were still there, the doors were still locked. But while the prayers were happening, God had already sent an angel. The angel entered the prison, the chains fell off, the doors opened. Peter couldn't even believe what was happening. But God had already determined his freedom before he even realized it. And I want to tell you that your prayer is not being ignored. Your cry is not being forgotten. Heaven is already in motion, and soon the chains will fall. Soon the doors will open. Soon you will see that God has always been in control. But until then, pray. Until then, believe. Until then, hold on. For those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. Those who trust in the Lord will never be put to shame. And in due time, God will exalt you, not because you deserve it, but because he is faithful, and he honors those who trust in him. So rise up, lift your head high, take a deep breath and carry on, because God has already decreed your victory. And no one can stop what he has determined for you. Write in the comments, God never fails, if you have felt his hand guiding your life. I know there are days when pain tries to silence your faith, days when questions are many and answers seem few. You look around and feel surrounded. Problems pile up, battles intensify, and inside your chest a silent scream echoes, God, where are you? But listen. He has never left your side. God is not distant. He is not indifferent. He has not turned his back on you. He is in the middle of this storm, in the fire, in this valley. The question is not whether God is present. The question is, can you recognize him even in the midst of pain? The disciples were caught in a storm. The boat was rocking, the waves threatened to swallow everything, and suddenly they saw a figure walking on the water. But they did not recognize Jesus. They thought it was a ghost. Fear prevented them from seeing the truth. And this happens to us too. When the storm is too intense, when the heart is overwhelmed, we can lose sight of the one who has always been there. But Jesus said, "It is I, do not be afraid." And that is the voice you need to hear right now. In the midst of your storm, in your weariness, in your despair, Jesus is saying, "It is I, do not be afraid." But Peter wanted proof. He said, "If it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And Peter went. He walked on the water. He experienced the supernatural. But then something happened. He took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink. The wind blew, the waves roared, and Peter let fear take over. The problem wasn't the wind. The problem wasn't the storm. The problem was where Peter placed his gaze. While he looked at Jesus, he walked on the water. When he looked at the storm, he sank. And that's the secret of faith. The storm may roar, but if your eyes are fixed on Jesus, you will stand firm. Fear may shout, but if your trust is in God, you will not be shaken. Because faith doesn't ignore the storm, but refuses to be dominated by it. Now take a look at your life. Where are you looking? Are you looking at the problems, at the impossibilities, at the fears, or are you looking at Jesus? Because what you focus on grows. If you focus on fear, fear grows. If you focus on doubt, doubt grows. But if you focus on God, your faith grows, and your faith needs to grow, because there are promises over your life that can only be reached through faith. There are doors that will only open when you take the step. There are miracles that will only happen when you choose to trust. Peter began to sink, but he did something right. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus took him by the hand and raised him up. This means that even when your faith wavers, even when your feet stumble, if you cry out, he holds you. He doesn't let you sink. He doesn't let you get lost in the storm. But you need to cry out. You need to call on him. Because God responds to those who call out in faith. And maybe that's what he's waiting for from you right now, for you to open your mouth, for you to cry out sincerely, for you to let go of control and say, "Lord, I trust in you." Because there's a release that only happens when you surrender everything into his hands. And if you surrender, he will take care of every detail. He will wipe away your tears. He will restore your strength. He will renew your hope. Because God never called you to live under the weight of fear. He called you to walk on water. He called you to experience the supernatural. But for that, you need to trust. You need to rise up. You need to take the next step. Even when it seems impossible, even when the wind keeps blowing, even when the waves remain strong. Because when God says come, you can walk in places where no one else would. You can cross paths that seemed impassable. You can see miracles that no one ever imagined. Now take a deep breath. Close your eyes for a moment and give him everything that has been weighing on your heart. Give him your fears. Give him your worries. Give him your dreams. And rest. Because God is in control, and what he started, he will finish. The storm will not last forever. The struggle will not be eternal, because God has already declared the end of your battle, and the end is victory. The end is the promise being fulfilled. The end is you looking back and seeing that it was all worth it. So don't stop now. Don't back down. Don't give up, because your story is not over yet. And he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. And at the right moment, at just the right time, you will see that everything was being guided by his hands. So rise up, embrace this truth, and keep walking, because the victory is already yours. Write in the comments, "I will win," if you believe that God is in control of all things. Share this blessed video so it can touch and help others like you and me. Want to dive even deeper into faith and prayer? Download our exclusive ebook on how to strengthen your spirituality in today's world. The link is in the comments below. Don't forget to click the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being part of our faith community. If you would like to support our channel a little more, consider becoming a member of our channel. I'm sharing 2 more videos here so you can continue your spiritual journey and growth in faith. Thank you, and may God bless you all. See you soon.